Hello student. Today I'm going to discuss about this topic, gender and governance, and this is part of that. I would be in fact discussing about the content of the course, particularly in order to make you understand that why we need to sort of understand this debate and bringing out this aspect of the gender in the governance. As you know that cutting across the globe, and even in the many countries we hear this whole noise, or I would say the buzzwords governance. Now one has to also understand that why suddenly that the modern states started talking about the governance. If we look at, in fact, historically, that the whole idea of governance in modern times, or the arrival of the modern democracy. For instance, that if we look at, the Western philosophy and the debates on Aristotle, Plato, and then later on we can see the others philosophers like Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, and then you see that in all those debates, the whole idea of the government and the governance which was there. Even in the Indian context, when we look at the Vedic period, these debates were very much existing. But then why is it that we need to speak about this today? I think to make you understand briefly, I will be sort of laying out the foundation, what is the content of the course and how do we go about it. For instance, that the first block of this course is dealing with the gender and the good governance. How do we understand, in fact, the concept called gender and good governance? In order to understand this, that we need to democratic period, or the what I said in the modern times. We are very much aware with this whole debate of the Industrial Revolution, the French Revolution, the democracy, the entry of the democracy or the democratic states, what we call it today. Now, in order to understand this, to gender inequality in the governance, then locating the gender in the governance discourse. For instance, if we look at the whole evolution, we can see that, but there is also been a debate between the individual and also the institutions. Now the question remains that how then this tradition and the modern political system, in fact, challenged those hierarchies and the different complexities which were existing on laws, and then demonstrated those those complexities that emerged through customs and the modern laws. Similarly, we have to also understand that, how the patriarchy, the debate between the patriarchy and the gender inequality which is there. And in fact, this goes on in the modern times also, in the modern political institution as well. So there has also been a shift from the government to the governance, and we need to revisit in the backdrop of the gendered, books to make you understand this debate on gender and governance, in which the both books, in fact, highlight this term. And then there was accountability which was demanded, in fact, time and again. So the works are extremely important to understand by both scholars to, navigate or to sort of makes us understand that the governance and the gender was much ignored area, and we need to recognize it. So in 1990s onwards, that this debate slightly has taken a shape at the international level, and one would see that at every point in time, in all aspects, all institutions, this debate was categorically included. And one has to also understand that, as I mentioned to you, that there is a hierarchy, there is a patriarchy which is existing, which was also existing, and there is an inequality due to that. So it's very important or a significant these issues to be understood in relation to the concept of the gender. Now, For instance, the idea of the gender is an integral part to the modern imagination of the human diversity. Like, for instance, when we start with this debate on sex and gender, you can categorically see that these debates are existing and eventually how it unfolded. Like, for instance, the category of sex is always seen as a biological category, and gender is something which is constructed. For your information, I would just cite one of the very renowned scholar whose work we have to sort of understand, and how this shifts have also taken place. Like, for instance, the Judith Butler's work Gendering Trouble, which is one of the key work which we have to also understand. Also, we need to also understand Gail Rubin's work in order to bring out those debates, sex versus gender, and then how then over a period of time in the modern times, or for instance in India, like 1990s onwards, this debates on the LGBTQ plus A emerge. Like, for instance, that we put under now the category of gender, the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, intersex, and so on and so forth. There are many categories which has been keep adding on. But the two important concept we again further need to understand is the masculinity and the patriarchy, which is still very dominating, prevalent in the society. Now, it's not that the patriarchy means a superiority, right, in the society, but it's also we need to understand the values, and then we need to also understand the values and customs which are constructed in the society by certain means. I mean, for example, it's a common thing to be said, behave like a man, or don't cry. You can never see that the male is crying, right? So this has again been since the childhood, right? There's a conditioning, or one would see the socialization process which is taken in the society in order to make you understand, or to sort of in a way to dominate in the society. So these binaries were always been there, but then slowly it's changing. In fact, it has also linkages with the psychological aspects, how in the public and private spheres these debates have been seen. So one has to also understand the notion of gender, which is again integrated with the changing governance, discourse of the changing governance. Like, for instance, if we sort of take an example of say that after India's independence, how many women parliamentarian were there, right? I mean, we do have the history. Women played significant role. It's not that they didn't, but then in the whole process there is also been an invisible contribution of them, which today we can talk about, but at that point of time no one was recognizing. So of course that mindset of course is changing. We also need to understand in order to sort of engage with this debate of the governance. Now, what does it mean, the governance also? It's also been the accountability, right? You can easily relate that when the elections are going on, in any democratic country, you can hear that the member who are sort of contesting the election happen to say that there is accountability. There is a manifesto, in fact, of each government or each party who is sort of contesting and part of the election. So each candidate, each party will have the manifestation in which those promises are given. Like, for instance, women's reservation was one of them, which was long time, many decades we debated in India. So who are going to go and represent whom also was a big debate which went on for 3 decades in India. And eventually you see that how things change, right? You can also relate in an everyday basis, like for instance, the metro, you travel in metro cities, there's a special one bogies for the women, or the reserved for the women, particularly in the buses and other places. And to make you understand this debate again further, you can sort of relate by reading some of the fascinating works like Iris Marion Young's and Anne Phillips' work, in which you can sort of understand the very basic concept of the representation, which has a direct linkages with the governance, because each government which come to power should have the accountability, and it's a public who has to who has to keep the accountability and raise the question, because through them only when they elect that. So but then the gender becomes again very, very crucial area, and therefore we need to understand the linkages between the gender and this concept called good governance in this through entire blocks. Now the block 2 of this particular course is dealing with the woman in local governance. There's a whole historical background of the local governments in India. As I already mentioned to you, that when we look at the Vedic period, right, we have the Sabha Samitis and so many domains in which that eventually you see that also the republic, which was also existing historically. Like for instance, the tribal community used to have. Then you also have the clans, like for instance the Shakya clans, which I'm figuring out these are the references which are there in the ancient time in our our text, which gives us the idea that this model was existing during that time. So not only drawing from that, but then eventually after post-independence, there was a much more effort done by Government of India to bring back the local governments in a place. There were different committees set and constituted by Government of India at state level and also national level. You would also see that 73rd, 74th Constitutional Amendment Act scheme. Also that women who used to be only limiting themselves in a public domain, eventually you see that they are coming, women used to be in a private domain, but slowly you can see the contribution of the woman as a change maker in the society at the grassroots level. So one has to also understand that there are different bodies which were set by Government of India, and there are so much efforts done. Like for instance, after India's independence, there were several committees were set. A report of the Committee on the Democratic Decentralization was established by Government of Maharashtra in 1969, and therefore that the local self-governance institution within the specific historical context which we need to sort of understand. At the same time, the 73rd and 74th constitutional amendments were there, where we can see that today the Sarpanch, right, the elected women who are Sarpanch, or also the Sarpanch main, and how, of course there was a debate. In fact, it's a long debate that the proxies, the women are the proxies and all, but that is also been counter argued by many scholars who work on Panchayati Raj systems. To cite some of them, that if you're more interested to read Sushila Kaushik's work, which is the one of the finest scholar at during 90s, where immensely wrote on Panchayati Raj system and of course the contribution of the woman. Then also that latest you can see the works, in fact, which is dealing with that, how it is shifting. But one has to also understand that the shift is taking place very strictly. Like for instance that there are certain rules and regulation also added by government, like for instance to contest the election, that you have to have only 2 children. Then and those measures have been taken only to sort of consider in context of the population of India, that the government was making certain mandatory rules who can contest, and 54th Amendment, which has brought a larger change in the lives of the women, particularly the rural women in India. And you would see that the Panchayati Raj institution, PRI, has become very, very significant as an integral part of the constitution in 1992. I mean, there are several, committees set up, for instance, that Balwant Rai Mehta Committee, Ashok Mehta Committee, then there is a Rao Committee, there is a LM Singhvi Committee. These committees, in fact, contributed so much, and they have done, in fact, a very detailed study at every level. For instance, Maharashtra, Karnataka, then also the other parts of India, Madhya Pradesh. So these committees were set up to, in fact, to look into how to bring back this system in a place. Like, for instance, that when we read Gandhi, we know that Hind Swaraj, when we read. So what does it mean that? So Gandhiji was, of course, in a favor with this debate, the Panchayati Raj, from the very beginning, and he quoted that. So you can see that how one can relate this debate with our great leaders in order to understand. But there has also been a very important contribution, in fact, at these committees, which gradually, shaped this three-tier at every level. One would see that Jilla Parishad, then also that and you can relate, also see how the elections have been contested, right? And then gradually that this now, if you go and visit, for instance, villages, you can see 20 years before what was, the road construction, how the situation was, the water supply was not there. So many changes in the everyday life, which you can see that done by the woman, who sort of contested the election as a part of the Panchayati Raj system and brought the changes in the lives of women. So when we see at the grassroots level, woman as a change maker, we have to recognize. So in this particular, in fact, course, we cited the example of from the West to India also. Like, for instance, we have given one case study of Rajni. This is, of course, again, a case study based on a Sarpanch called Rajni from the Uttar Pradesh, and how she brought a change in the lives of the people. So women are not only limiting when they, sort of reached to a decision making, or they are in the position of power. They can certainly will bring out the changes in the lives of the people. Particular chapter is focusing on that. Now, you have to also understand that, again, for instance, women in legislation is a very important aspect. Comparative best practices, which are again been a very, very important practices, which informs and tells us that we need to bring out the changes. Also the legal literacy and the leadership. Now, why it is important, the role of the woman in legislation? Because, it was never been seriously discussed. The legislation is the process. Of course, we do elect, but eventually you would see that how the question of patriarchy related with the politics being questioned across the globe, as I mentioned to you earlier. At the same time, that the exclusive spaces which women demand and, sort of made for themselves. So the role of the woman in legislation is a very important. Like, for instance, that by the people. But if the violence against women in the particular specific areas are going on, we have the right to go and ask at least to them that, is there anything which you are going to go and contribute for us? Now, woman makes a broader contribution even in the legislation process, and I think the representation and the participation of the woman, which is very important in the political process of the, when we look at the the specific area of the politics and the governance. Now, the relationship of the law, which is again been a very important, we have to also understand the impact of the developmental policies. For instance, the globalization and post-globalization phase, labor force participation in key sectors, changing nature of the occupational association, challenges to the informal sector. Now, when we talk about the globalization, most of the people do argue that, in 1990s that we do talk about the globalization emerge, but it's not the case. For instance, historically, if we look at, one would see that, there is a Silk Road, we still have the evidences. We do know that Vasco da Gama or others like Columbus or Ibn Battuta, all of them, they arrived. Even the Britishers entered in our country to do the business. So the capitalism, the capitalist forces were always been there. The mass capital and technology, culture, goods and services across the globes were there. They arrived. Now we need to make a distinction that, what is primary good and the secondary good in the labor market. Like for instance, that for the basic survival of the human being or the society, we have the agriculture lands, we cultivate that. But the secondary, the primary and secondary, the primary is that where the human beings are, totally based on their livelihood. Right, these are the basic needs of the human, which is connected with the nature also. But in the secondary needs, that one has to see the communication, how these debates are going on. In the context of also in a labor, that, we do have the Ministry of the Labor and Employment, Government of India, and it ensures the life with the dignity, right, of the labor forces in the country. So we need to also understand how these things have been folded, and the occupational, existence, that on the basis that how in everyday basis also the industry is changing. So one has to also understand this debate in order to understand this, the women and criminal justice system. For instance, that how do we define crime? Access to justice is always been denied also to the people who are in the margin. There is a role of the women lawyers, also the judicial reforms, women in the conflict with law. So these are the key aspects which will cover and which is going to, inform you that how that process has taken, how the laws have been changed. Recently, couple of years before, we have new Nyaya Samhitas by government. So the criminal and the civil laws, how those things have been changed, and I think this was also been a long time we were waiting for. So in order to make you understand this, particularly the gender and governance course is going to go and sort of navigate and introduce to you the fundamental concept which was long time ignored, and which you are going to go and understand by reading everything. But I would also urge to you that, go through also the material which is existing, but try to also read and relate the new existing laws which are there. So I'm pretty sure that you are going to engage with this course in a, judiciously, and which will also help you for your personal growth and to make you understand how you're going to go and negotiate in the society in the context of the gender. Thank you so much.